Hi, this is Ted Morrissey, and making a video for my classic horror and sci-fi by women writers course for Lindenwood University. And today we're talking about a couple of stories, neither of which is as well known as some of the other stuff that we're reading this term, but they both offer a lot of food for thought in terms of our own narrative and things like that. The first piece that I want to talk about briefly is A Wedding Guest by Vernon Lee. And this was first published in a collection of fantastic tales that came out in 1904 by Vernon Lee. And as you know, this is a story that begins with a pretty detailed description of this wedding chest. And in the first paragraph of the story, it describes it in some detail. Number 428, it says, that's the very beginning of the story, a panel 5 feet by 2 feet 3 inches, formerly the front of a caisson or coffer, intended to contain the garments and jewels of a bride. And it goes on from there. And then eventually these panels are described in detail. This is the second paragraph. He had divided the panel into four portions or regions intended to represent the four phases of the amorous passion. The first was a pleasant country, abundantly watered with twisting streams, great plenty and joyousness, etc., etc. And so then he goes on in great detail for an entire page or so and describes this wedding chest in each region of each panel that it's divided into in great detail. And on the discussion board and in some of our comments and so forth, I talked about the fact that this is an interesting technique because essentially what happens then is these panels, in a sense, sort of foreshadow what is going to be taking place in the story, right? Of course, obviously, we don't know that when we first read these descriptions. So I want to come back to that in just a second here. But the other thing I wanted to point out here is this is a type of intertextuality. And intertextuality is something I'm really interested in. It's one of those kind of defining characteristics of postmodern literature, and that's something that I am particularly interested in. It's not unique to postmodern literature, but it is, again, one of the characteristics that tends to identify something as postmodern, even if it didn't appear necessarily in the so called postmodern period from roughly the end of World War II to, I don't know, the end of the 20th century. Maybe we're still postmodern. We don't really know. But intertextuality, as it implies, is when texts are connecting and sort of communicating with each other. And the way they normally way it normally happens in literature is that a writer will include another text, either by giving, quotes from it, uh, describing it. The text could be another type of literature. So whenever someone brings, for example, a prose writer brings a poem or lines from a poem into their short story or their novel, they're creating this intertextual moment. Could be song lyrics. It could be anything really, any kind of text. But again, it doesn't have to be just words. It could be describing a work of art, as we have in A Wedding Chest, right, where the description of the artwork is a sort of intertext with the prose of the main narrative, right? It could be describing any kind of artwork. It could be describing a painting, and so on. So intertextuality can involve any kind of text as broadly defined as you want it to be. And essentially, by bringing in this other text, you are bringing with it, the sort of symbols and associations and images and ideas and so forth that it carries within its text, and inserting those into your text, presumably for a sort of specific aesthetic effect, maybe to amplify or to contrast with some of the ideas and images and themes that you're already working with in your narrative, sometimes to advance the plot. Obviously, there's all kinds of reasons you might want to do that, but here Vernon Lee has introduced an intertextual situation by describing in detail this chest and the various scenes that are depicted on it. Again, she does it for a sort of foreshadowing effect, and that certainly can be one of its uses. Why would one do that? Maybe as a reader encounters these different elements in the story, there is a sort of deja vu sort of effect, maybe almost subliminally, because unless you were to have a photographic memory, you wouldn't necessarily remember these panel descriptions in detail as you encounter these various images. Or obviously on another reading, it makes more sense. I mentioned on the discussion board that this very specific example makes me think of the horror film Midsommar, which some of you may be familiar with, and if you aren't, I highly recommend. It is a great horror film, pretty recent. It came out in the last 2 or 3 years, I believe. And one of the things I think makes Midsommar a must watch for anyone who's interested in writing horror or making horror films, etc., is because it is a horror film that is frightening and unsettling and disquieting and horrifying and all those things, while meanwhile kind of breaking all the rules about normally what's supposed to cause those effects. So it basically doesn't do any of the things in the way that you would expect a horror film to do them, but yet accomplishes, again, all of these really unsettling, frightening kinds of things. Just one example, I don't want to give too much away, obviously, but we normally associate horror with darkness, right? Things happen at night, it's stormy, it's gloomy. We've talked before about the Gothic imagery of a abandoned castle or haunted house. And again, this kind of dark and somber mood. Midsommar, basically the entire film takes place in this beautiful, bright, sunny day, outdoors most of the time. And so you don't expect, horrific things to happen, in that kind of environment, but yet they do, right? But I bring up that film in association with this idea of the description of the panels because on a first viewing, you don't necessarily really pick up on it, and I didn't pick up on it until I, watched this film, and it was so incredibly good and had such an impact on me that I looked up some YouTube videos where people are talking about it, and someone pointed out the fact that near the beginning of the film, the camera pans across these sort of folk art pieces, and basically the entire movie is laid out like kind of like a storyboard right there. But you don't realize, of course, at the time until you've seen the movie. And then if you go back and look at these panels, like, oh, okay, that's what's going on there. And it's a very odd effect. But again, maybe one of the things it's doing is kind of planting these sort of seeds in your mind. So as you encounter these events in the film, you have this sort of deja vu or kind of uncanny feeling, maybe something like that. I mentioned on the discussion board that it also kind of reminds me of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which is this mammoth, almost completely unreadable novel, I guess. No one's quite sure what it is really. But on the first page of this 650-page, Goliath of a book, basically Joyce gives a summary of the entire book. Now, of course, you don't know that reading the book for the first time. But in retrospect, he does that. Now, obviously, it's not in detail. And as the book progresses, you get these various sort of ideas and images expressed in greater and greater detail. But still, giving it, the entire book, in essence, kind of a blurb, if you will, on the very first page of this huge novel that he then is expecting you to kind of wade through for the next 650 pages or so. So a couple of techniques I think we can consider there as writers ourselves. One is this idea of intertextuality, bringing in some other kind of text into your narrative. And it could be a text from elsewhere. It could be, a poem that you borrow from somewhere else. Obviously, you got to worry about copyright if it's too recent of a work, or song lyrics or artwork, or whatever. Or it could be your own thing. I often write about writers, particularly poets. And so in several of my books, I'll have these characters who are poets, and I'll bring some of their poetry into the narrative. But of course, it's poetry that I wrote. Supposedly in the persona of this poet character. So it's sort of creating its own intertextual, essence. Even though I'm the one creating both texts, they sort of work off of each other. So you don't have to pull in material from elsewhere. You can create it yourself. I'm a big fan of the writer Shelley Jackson. If you've taken my experimental writing course, and other courses of mine, I share her work or put that on the reading list. I talk about her, and I bring her up in this context because she is not just a writer, but also an artist, and she experiments with computer technology and coding and all those kinds of things. And so all of her works are these intertextual creations, and generally speaking, she's creating all of the text, even if it's artwork, even if it's computer software, whatever it might be. Right. So there is that to consider as well. And then the other thing that, again, I think we could consider is this idea of foreshadowing and giving the reader, hints or even sort of synopses of what's about to come in the beginning of our work. And it's sort of counterintuitive because I think as writers, we think, oh, we've got to keep a lot unknown or kind of hidden away from the reader to encourage them to keep following the breadcrumbs through the story or the novel or whatever it might be to figure out the end of the story, or to find out the end of the story. But a lot of writers have played with this idea of just putting it all out there. I think of Homer's Odyssey as well, if you're familiar with that poem. In just the first few lines of that poem, Homer pretty much tells us everything that's about to happen. Talks about the, Odysseus being held on Calypso's island, and about being released, and about his encounter with the Cyclops, and yada, yada, yada. Gives all this information on the very first page, the first few lines of this poem. And yet we are compelled to read on and get more details about these things we already essentially know about, right? So that's something to consider as well. The other piece that we looked at was, and I think Mary E. Wilkins Freeman is maybe a little more widely read these days than Vernon Lee. I know I've encountered other stories of hers in other anthologies that I've used to teach other courses along the way here and there. But The Hall Bedroom first appeared in Collier's magazine in 1903. And I guess there's maybe two or three things I would kind of point to here that might be food for thought, as I say, as writers, that we might want to consider for our own work. As you know, the story begins with the narrator introducing herself. My name is Mrs. Elizabeth Jennings, and she goes into sort of this autobiographical, description of kind of how she came to be a person who's running a boarding house where a strange event eventually takes place. And then on the second page of the story, we switch gears and we are given the journal of Mr. George H. Wheatcroft. She says, I shall show you the portions beginning on January 18th of the present year, the date when he took up his residence with me. Here it is. And then we drop down a line, and we have January 18th, 1883. And then we are in the voice, the persona of George H. Wheatcroft. And he essentially narrates the rest of the story until we come to the very end. And then we break out of that. The first narrator writes, this finishes the journal which Mr. Wheatcroft left in his hall bedroom. The morning after the last entry, he was gone. And then kind of goes on from there. We have a couple of paragraphs that kind of, bring the whole story to a conclusion. So it is a very classic frame narrative, for one thing. So you begin in the outside frame of this woman who runs a boarding house, and she says a strange thing happened, but she's going to let this journal of this Wheatcroft guy tell the tale. So then we have the interior, of the frame being the journal entry. And then at the very end, we come back to the frame, the outside frame, and she becomes our narrator again and kind of finishes the tale. Frame narratives are among the oldest kind of narrative devices. We can go back to 1001 Arabian Nights, the Canterbury Tales, you name it. And we can find examples going back thousands of years to frame narratives, right? But they are very effective and they still work very well today. I'm sure you can think of all kinds of modern novels, short stories, films, and so on that are frame narratives that begin in one narrative mode, switch gears to another, and then we go back to the frame at the end. Shakespeare was a big fan of frame narrative. I think of The Taming of the Shrew in particular, where basically the entire text of the play is the internal narrative about the taming of the shrew. But what people sometimes forget is that play actually begins with a drunken character, being set up to watch this narrative. Now, weirdly, Shakespeare never concludes the frame. We're just kind of left hanging with that initial structure, then the play itself, and then we never come back to the frame. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, again, classic frame narrative about Captain Walton, trying to reach the North Pole. He encounters this strange character who's nearly frozen to death on the ice, who turns out to be Victor Frankenstein, who then tells his tale of how he ended up there, close to the North Pole, starving to death, with just one dog left from his sled dog team, etc. And so then at the end of the novel, we come back out of that frame and finish Walton's story, right? So tried and true, but certainly worth thinking about in your own storytelling. If you haven't tried a frame narrative, give it a go. There are variations, as I mentioned, including not completing the frame, as Shakespeare played with in The Taming of the Shrew. Seems to have worked out for him. Sometimes we go back and forth. Sometimes it isn't just that there's the frame at the beginning and the end. Sometimes we go back and touch base with the frame. I think of Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a frame narrative. Again, we begin with this old guy on the wharf, basically telling his weird story to this young man who's on his way to a wedding, feast or whatever. And he stops him and tells him this strange story. But several times throughout The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge brings us back to the original narrative, and we are reminded of the fact that this old guy is telling this story to this young guy on his way to this wedding feast or whatever. And then eventually we come out of the frame at the end. So there we kind of touch the frame, if you will, throughout the story. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, she played with not just a frame narrative, but a frame within a frame within a frame. So we actually have this sort of collapsing and then telescoping kind of frame narrative. Very, very complicated and sophisticated, especially considering that she was a little more than a teenager when she wrote that. And it was her first book of that type that she had tried to write. So pretty ambitious narrative structure for her to pursue, which again seems to have worked out okay for her, right? So there's lots of variations. So think about that a little bit. What's a frame narrative or a framing device that you might use with a narrative, and how do you want to kind of play with that frame, right? The other thing I wanted to mention here, and another thing, there's a couple of things, is again, we've got this intertextual situation where we bring in the text of this journal with the main text of the narrative of the story. So there's that again. But here, we're playing with a journal, which again is very classic kind of intertextual device. I mentioned in the discussion board the novel Dracula, which is from this same kind of time period. I think Dracula was published in 1897 originally, so very, very close in time to these two stories that we're looking at, which were, the very, very early years of the 1900s. So within 5 years or so of publication of Dracula. But if you're familiar with Dracula, and Stoker is an epistolary novel, but it's journal entries from various characters, it's letters, it's also newspaper clippings, all this stuff that Stoker has kind of presumably accumulated and then put together to create the narrative of Dracula. So that's something else we could think about is, maybe in a modern sense, what would be ways of bringing different kinds of material together in order to create this sort of multimodal epistolary kind of texture. If you've taken my experimental writing course, as perhaps some of you have, one of the things that we talk about is internet fiction, which is obviously a very new brand of fiction. It's a new twist on narrative, I guess I should say. It's not brand new. In fact, it's related to this. In of course, internet fiction can take lots of different forms, but kind of as I think of it, generally, a writer will construct a narrative that requires the reader to use online stuff. So they might have to read a tweet or a thread of tweets. They might have to look at a YouTube video. They might have to go to a Facebook page. But the thing is, it generally kind of bounces them around. So the narrative maybe begins online, or I guess it could be in printed text, but then it sort of references and directs them to, again, Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or whatever it might be. And sometimes the writer is using existing material. They have found tweets or YouTube videos or whatever it might be that they've woven into their narrative. So again, very much like taking newspaper clippings and things in the old days and putting them together. Or they can be plants. Sometimes writers will create Twitter accounts or Facebook pages or YouTube videos or whatever it might be, and post them or upload them or whatever as part of their narrative. So they then direct you to things they have planted out there in cyberspace to kind of pull you along the narrative or whatever. But that's definitely, I think, a very new variation of what someone like Bram Stoker was doing, at the end of the 19th century by bringing together diary entries, letters, newspaper clippings, and so on. All right. So that was another thing I thought we could maybe think about and draw from for our own inspiration. And finally, as you know, in the hall bedroom, it ends in this sort of mystery, right, where we don't know what happens to these people who go into this mysterious hall bedroom. They go in and never come out again, right? And so one of my other big interests, as you may know if you've had other courses with me, is revisionist fiction, and that's where you take a story, a character, and you sort of create your own narrative using that as sort of inspiration. Some people think of it as fan fiction. Some people use revisionist fiction and fan fiction as synonymous terms. I think there's a difference, but we won't get into that here. But in revisionist fiction, then you create your own narrative, again, inspired by some other literature or whatever it might be. It could be a prequel. It could be a sequel. It could be retelling the story from another character's perspective. Could be a number of things. But here, I'm wondering if, we have this Mr. Wheatcroft, and we were alluded to other guests who have entered this room and never come out, and there's some mysterious things about where they might have gone, et cetera, et cetera. What about writing a story of our own where we answer that question and we kind of come up with a narrative that sort of responds to Mary Wilkins Freeman's story about where these people disappeared to, right? Something like that. My wife read somewhere that Stephen King said that his story, which was made into a miniseries back in the 90s called Storm of the Century, was like one of his like favorite things he ever wrote, or maybe the miniseries was like one of the most successful adaptations of his work, or something like that. Whatever it was, it led us to finding it online. And so last week we watched this miniseries, again, it's from the 90s. So it's a little out of date in terms of the way we expect modern storytelling to unfold or whatever, but still really interesting story. It's Stephen King, so there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. But the reason I allude to it here is in that story, which is about this isolated little island off the coast of New England. And there's this terrible snowstorm that's about to strike the island. So as the story begins, everyone is sort of battening down the hatches, so to speak, and getting ready for the snowstorm. But in the course of the story, the story of Roanoke keeps coming up. And of course, as you remember from your American colonial history, pre-American history, that the colony of Roanoke just disappeared, right? It was there, and then when people came back, it wasn't, and there was that mysterious word that was left, which may be a clue as to where the colonists went or what happened to them or whatever, but we just don't know. Well, that's alluded to a few times in the story, and then eventually, again, not to give anything away, but there is this suggestion that what could happen to this isolated little island is what did happen to the colonists at Roanoke. So basically, Stephen King is kind of playing around with history and coming up with a theory for what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke and where they went and what happened to them, because this other group of people, it may happen to them, right? So really interesting kind of revisionist approach there, right? And so again, that may be some sort of inspiration we can take from these two stories, right? So I just wanted to kind of go over some of my thoughts and where we might draw some inspiration and some fodder for our own writing from these stories. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on these techniques, these ideas, maybe examples of your own that kind of fit the bill in terms of some of the issues that I raised in this video. And I will see you down the digital trail.